Hi, you already met me. My name is DiPaolo. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I'm a sexual health specialist with Chicago Public Schools Office of Student Health and Wellness. And I'm going to talk about the main part of my job, which is sexual health education. So first, before we start, I know we're not like in a room full of sex educators, but does anybody currently teach sexual health education? Yes. Okay. Does anybody work with people who teach sexual health education? Yeah, okay. And how many of you work directly with students, even if it's not sexual health education? Okay, great. So some of this is going to be very sex ed focused. Some of it is going to be, most of it is going to be very applicable, I think, to other areas of teaching as well, specifically thinking about health and including our LGBTQ students, whether we're actually teaching a sex ed class or not. So this is me. So like I said, I'm Marissa. I am extremely passionate about this topic. I was a gender and sexuality studies major in undergrad and like just discovered a huge passion for sex ed, and specifically from my lived experience as a queer person in high school who had sex ed, but it was pretty mediocre and didn't include LGBTQ folks at all. I realized that this was just like a topic that I'm super passionate about. And so this is like a long form version of a training that a part of a training. Esther and I train sexual health education teachers in CPS, and they get like a 20-30 minute version of this. So this is like the expanded version. So hopefully we have some time to practice and talk to each other about these topics as we go through. I'm also happy to have people interrupt me with questions as learning objectives because I'm a nerd about curriculum and training and stuff like that. So I hope by the end of this presentation, everyone will be able to use gender inclusive language to teach sexual health education, explain the importance of providing LGBTQ inclusive sexual health education, and identify at least 3 strategies you can use when you're teaching inclusive sex ed. Okay. All right, so this is how I always start this training because I want to just have common language and make sure everybody's on the same page. I know everyone in this room probably knows every single one of these terms, but I'll really quickly just run through. This is what I teach our Chicago Public School staff. So LGBTQ, when we talk about LGBTQ inclusive sex ed, who are we talking about including? We're talking about lesbians, often used by women who are attracted to other women. The G in LGBTQ stands for gay, people who are attracted to people of the same gender. B stands for bisexual, people who are attracted to 2 or more genders. T stands for trans or transgender, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. And then the Q stands for queer or questioning. And the plus, we use LGBTQ plus in CPS in an effort to include everybody under the umbrella, even if their chosen identity term is not represented by LGBTQ. I like to point out for folks that this language is constantly changing, and it's important that people, use the words that feel right to them. Definitions might differ from person to person. And importantly, with thinking about the Q, so questioning, super developmentally appropriate thing to be doing at literally every age, to be questioning our gender or sexual identities, but especially common among young folks. And then the term queer, I just always remind teachers that this is a term that has historically been used as a slur, and I typically recommend that teachers don't use that term to describe folks unless they self-identify that way, just so that they make sure that they're using terms everybody feels comfortable with. Okay, so the main thing I like to do to start this training is to talk about all these definitions on this slide using the gender unicorn. I'm going to give everybody a chance to practice doing this later on, actually out loud, to your peers. But the gender unicorn is an incredible teaching tool for teaching young folks about gender and sexual orientation, and something that I think is great with adults too, because we have a visual representation of all this terminology. So I'll just run through these definitions just again to make sure we all have shared language and common understanding. So gender identity represented by the rainbow coming out of the unicorn's head in the thought bubble, because that is somebody's internal sense of who they are, of their gender. They might identify as a woman, a man, a girl, a boy, gender queer, gender fluid, agender. So that is somebody's internal sense of self. It's something people can only know about themselves on the inside. We can't assume someone's gender identity just by looking at them. So that brings us to gender expression presentation, the dotted line on the unicorn's body, which is the part we can see on the outside. So gender expression might be more feminine, more masculine, somewhere in the middle, somewhere completely outside of that. So how people show their gender to the world. As an example, you might look at me because I have long hair and go, that's a girl. And I'm gonna say, no, that's wrong. I am not a girl on the inside. So I wouldn't want you to assume that just by looking at me. So just a reminder that we can't assume people's gender identities based on how they look on the outside. And for people who work with young students in particular, also want people to remember that young folks often can't control what clothes they wear, how they wear their hair. They might not get to decide that. They might not have that agency yet. So especially important that we're not making assumptions about students' gender based on how they look. All right, and then we have sex assigned at birth. So that's the DNA symbol between the unicorn flags. Sex assigned at birth is the sex, typically male or female, that a doctor or midwife decides based on typically just the appearance of the baby's external genitalia. So they look between the baby's legs and they see a penis and they say it's a boy, or they see a vulva and they say it's a girl. But we know now that sex is more expansive than that. It is not just these two binary categories that we have always been taught that it is, because many people are born intersex. So folks who are born with different combinations of sex characteristics that do not fit neatly into the box of male or female. And so it's really important when we're thinking about sexual health education and bodies that people have that are inclusive of intersex people, because not everybody's bodies fit into these two neat boxes that we've been taught that there are. And that is just true. Intersex folks are as common as people with red hair. So there are intersex folks in your classroom, even if you don't know that there are. And then finally, we have sexual attraction and romantic attraction. I think of this as two dimensions of sexual orientation. So thinking about who someone is sexually attracted to, physically attracted to, and who somebody is romantically or emotionally attracted to. Remembering that all of these identity terms are, each of these is a spectrum, meaning, and as you can see on the gender unicorn graphic, it starts at 0. So some people experience little to no sexual attraction or romantic attraction. People might use the words asexual or aromantic to describe their sexual orientation if that applies to them. A lot of young folks abbreviate those as ace and aro. So if you hear students using those terms, that's what they mean. So the gender unicorn is a tool that we have in our sexual health curriculum starting in like 5th and 6th grade. So it's something that also staff can like hang up in their classroom as reminders of what all these terms mean, or just as like a sign of inclusion, a sign of support, I should say. And it's a great teaching tool. All right, so I did also want to give some background about our context in Chicago, because I know that it's very different from a lot of other places right now around sexual health education in particular, well, and LGBTQ inclusion. So CPS has had a sexual health education policy since 2013 that has required sexual health education in all grades every year, pre-K through 12th grade. We added pre-K in 2020 when we updated our policy. So it is now truly all grades. We have our own curriculum. So it's a massive 14-grade curriculum. It is an in-house curriculum. So the other big part of my job when I'm not working with teachers or with youth is revising that curriculum right now. So we are working on making revisions to the curriculum to make it more LGBTQ inclusive. I have a slide at the end with like tips for making your curriculum more inclusive, even if you can't change your curriculum. Yeah.
I'm just curious, since this is pre-K all the way up, and law in Florida says age appropriate, obviously this would be age appropriate in discussing all of these things. What do you do that differentiates between like pre-K to 3rd grade to 12th grade that makes it so that anyone here that's from Florida or from another state that is making it difficult could look to what you're doing and say, aha, now I know what age appropriate
is. That's a great question. I actually have some of that built into the slide deck. So something that I'm going to talk about, not on this slide, but I think it's a segue, is the National Sex Ed Standards. So everything, our curriculum is aligned with the National Sex Ed Standards, and that lists out like what is considered age appropriate and what knowledge students should have by the end of 2nd grade, by the end of 5th grade, by the end of 8th grade, by the end of high school. So it is broken out by grade. And a few of the tips that I'm going to share later, I have a bunch of like pre-K to 2 examples, because I know that's something that's maybe surprising to a lot of educators that we can actually talk about this content at such young ages. So I like to always give those examples. Great question. Hopefully we'll answer it throughout. Yes, so we're updating our curriculum right now, and I also love talking about like adapting curricula to be more inclusive. So if anybody wants to talk about that later, let me know. Okay, and so then now we also have a very supportive law in Illinois around LGBTQ inclusive sex ed. Well, it's not the best sex ed law in the world, but it says if you teach sex ed, you don't have to, but if you do, it has to be like the best sex ed a kid has ever received. So technically, the law requires that if sex ed is taught, it needs to be inclusive and sensitive to the needs of students based on their status as pregnant, parenting, living with STIs, including HIV, sexually active, asexual, or intersex, or based on their gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, sexual behavior, or disability. So we need to be inclusive of students based on all of these things. Many of the things that are listed are related to LGBTQ inclusion. And this is also aligned to the national sex ed standards. The law requires that our sex ed be aligned to the national sex ed standards, part of why we're updating our curriculum right now. Okay, pop quiz. What percentage of Chicago Public Schools high school students do you think identify as LGBTQ? This is data from the 2021 Youth Risk Behavior Survey, off the presses. Okay, yeah, give me a 1, 2, or 3, or an A, B, or C.
C.
I'm hearing a lot of C, you're right. Yes, okay, you guys know how many queer kids there are because you work with them. Yeah, so based on the 2021 Youth Risk Behavior Survey, 29.1% of CPS high school students identify as LGBTQ. So that's a lot of students. And what does that actually look like? So in a high school classroom of 28 students, as an example, that would mean that on average 8 students identify as LGBTQ. And so what I always tell our staff is if you don't think that you have LGBTQ students in your classroom, you're just wrong, because you do. With these numbers, clearly they're there. They're somewhere. You might not know that they're out. They might not be out to you specifically, but they are there. And so that's kind of like the most basic reason why we need to teach all of our education in an LGBTQ inclusive way. And we'll talk more about sex ed and what that looks like as we keep going. I think so.
Okay.
I think so. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. All right. So I mentioned the national sex ed standards earlier. So these are also just some of the, just to ground us in like what national experts say sex ed should look like in terms of inclusivity. This is some of the stuff that the national sex ed standards lists, like, and it's kind of upfront about like how to teach quality sex ed. And a lot of this is about avoiding cisnormative, heteronormative approaches, challenging harmful stereotypes, being inclusive of different viewpoints, not stigmatizing anyone. And I also just really like that the NSES also asserts that nobody else is qualified to label or judge another person's sexual orientation or gender identity. So like really thinking about how we can't make assumptions about students, which is just a core part of teaching good sex ed. But when we think about sexual orientation and gender identity, not assuming what students need, knowing that there's so many different perspectives and experiences in our classroom. Okay, so let's think about this. Why is it especially important, thinking specifically about sexual health education, to teach in LGBTQ inclusive ways? Yeah.
LGBTQ folks have bodies and like have sex and have relationships and deal with consent issues just like everyone else.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
When I do this work, I try to tell educators in particular that LGBTQ inclusion and affirmation, like affirming, is beneficial to everyone. Yes. Like I see that boys in particular suffer a lot from patriarchy. And when I can tell them like your gender is not tied to your masculinity or your toughness in my classroom, like they're able to more fully participate in school and feel safe and be vulnerable and talk about their feelings and what they're experiencing. So when we disrupt the notion of a binary gender and gender stereotypes in general, that is something that is beneficial to every single person of every gender and every orientation.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That is incredible. Yes. Other thoughts?
Well, I would just think that whatever is covered in this is covered for everyone, right? So everybody has sex in all different ways and doesn't have sex. So I think how diseases are passed or anal sex is not just for gay men.
Right. Right. Yes.
Just saying it includes everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's also like you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yes.
So I think sex ed and this idea gives you the openness to be like, oh, this is something that's normal, natural, and anybody can be with it, as opposed to creating this shaming system, right? For
men that grow up and it's like, I gotta do this fighting because now I married a woman that I don't want to be with, right? So all sorts of things. So I think that's what's important as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I also think to not do LGBTQ inclusive sex ed is just to be inaccurate. And
Yes.
incomplete. It's like bad
Yes.
education.
Exactly. It is incomplete. It is not painting the whole picture of sexual health because like so many of you said, there's just a myriad ways that people engage in sexual activity, engage in sexual behaviors, have different, STI risks or pregnancy risks, and we need to just be mindful in including everyone when we're talking about this.
I also think about too, with like being someone who grew up never having any kind of inclusive sexual health education, like if you don't get it from a professional, then you're going to look elsewhere for it. And that was very problematic for me as trying to outsource this kind of information on like a Yahoo private chat room or something.
Yeah, so we know that if students don't get this information from us, they're going to get it somewhere else. And we don't know how supportive or safe those resources that they seek are going to be. Yeah.
I think another, in addition to that, similar, is that like if I had been taught LGBTQ inclusive sex ed, I think it would have given it would have helped me understand who I am more, rather than like having figured out more on my own later in life.
Yes.
Because I was raised in a very compulsive heteronormative, what's this phrase?
I don't know.
Compulsive
heterosexuality.
That's what I'm saying, right? Because I'm like, oh, okay, well. I guess that's what I am, right? Because that's like the only thing that's presented to me. So I think it also allows students to be more aware of the representation and what is actually available to you, rather than only focusing on one thing and saying you have to fit yourself into this whether you want to or not. And you can instead be like there are all these different ways to be and they're all valid. Right. And rather than letting someone discover on their own in sometimes unsafe ways.
Exactly. And so as we're going to talk about later, inclusive sex ed also involves teaching students about gender identity and sexual orientation, and actually just comprehensive sex ed, don't even put the inclusive in front of it, includes teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation. And so we can teach students about these things so they can understand themselves and their peers better as well, so that they can be supportive of other folks in their school buildings and in their lives. Okay, I think y'all covered way more than this, so I'm just gonna skip it, but it's in the slides. I'm gonna show you really quick mental health suicidality data. Will be really quick, but just if you need to take care of yourself, take a beat, feel free to do that. I do always ground our teachers also in this data. I don't like spending a lot of time on it, but it is just important to get the people on board who are struggling to get on board, because the reality of this is that including LGBTQ students in our schools and making sure they feel safe and supportive is suicide prevention work. We know that our LGBTQ students, this is just in CPS, are just 3 times more likely to have experienced depression and suicidality from our users behavior survey data. And so we just know that including them in all aspects of our schools, and that it just includes sex ed, is super important, because this data was actually shared in another presentation already. It's the same study, but we have data that shows that something as simple as using a young person's chosen name actually reduces those health disparities in terms of mental health, actually reducing their depression symptoms and their suicide attempts by such significant amounts. So that's something as simple as using somebody's name. So that doesn't even consider the many other ways we can go beyond that to be supportive of our students and inclusive. All right. Okay, so we talked about why it's important. We're going to move to talking about how you actually teach this education in an inclusive way. What I'm using to just kind of paste this presentation and give us ideas comes from the gender spectrum principles for gender inclusive puberty and health education. I've been discovering that a lot of health teachers don't know this exists. This guide is amazing. If you are somebody who actually teaches sex ed or trains teachers or anything like that, I highly recommend reading this, the whole thing. But what I'm going to do is go through their 5 core principles for teaching inclusive puberty and health education. Some of this is more specific to puberty, but the vast majority of it can be applied to any health education at all. Yeah, go ahead and slide it. Okay, so these are the 5 principles from the Gender Spectrum Guide about gender inclusive puberty and health education. The first one is provide a foundation of gender literacy. So that's what I alluded to just before. We're actually going to teach about gender starting at very young ages. We are going to distinguish patterns from rules, emphasize physiology rather than gender, describe many pathways to adult bodies, and describe many pathways to families. And I'm going to talk about each of these in more depth for the next bit of this presentation. Okay, so here's the standards I was talking about, the examples. So provide a foundation of gender literacy. This means we're going to acknowledge that gender and sex are not binary. Just like I did with the gender unicorn at the beginning of this presentation, that's an example of how young folks can be taught about gender identity and sexual orientation, how they're different, how gender identity is different from gender expression and sex assigned at birth, and really disrupting those like binary categories that we've been taught in our society are the only true right, gender and sex categories. So disrupting that idea. We also know that young people understand gender at a very early age. It was also already said sometime in the conference how the American Academy of Pediatrics has said that students start understanding their gender as young as the age of 3. So this means we're talking about all grades when we talk about providing a foundation of gender literacy, and perhaps especially younger grades for them to start learning early on. So this is just a couple examples of the standards for K-2 from the National Sex Ed Standards. So that means that according to the National Sex Ed Standards, comprehensive sex ed, by the end of 2nd grade, students will be able to define gender, gender identity, and gender role stereotypes. So that's a really great way we can start talking about gender and disrupting the binary. Even if you're in a school system where you can't teach about like gender identity and sex assigned at birth, we can talk about gender role stereotypes, right? Like, and kind of disrupting like what students can and can't do based on their gender. So we can interrupt that early on. Discuss the range of ways that people express their gender and how gender role stereotypes may limit behavior, like I said. So talking about things that people can and can't do. And I think little kids have a lot of fun talking about that too. So that's the first one, provide a foundation of gender literacy. And now you have your first activity that I mentioned earlier. So everybody get with a partner, and I'm just gonna have you teach the gender unicorn to each other. So you can take turns if you want to like break it up and do part of it. But this is one way that you can teach these topics to your students. I thought everyone should practice. So I'll just give you guys like 5 minutes and get with a partner, and you can practice teaching the gender unicorn to each other.
I've heard about the gender unicorn in my research. Okay. There's also like a gender universe, like a gender. Because it's not as like, it's more like space. Yeah, there's like one teacher that I spoke to said that like they used uniform for a little bit, and then they had used like it was like a gender like space. It's not
I didn't realize that was DNA. I was like, is that a mask? Like, it took me a minute.
It felt like there were not enough I do this on
I just started seeing
I've been doing this for years.
I just learned this on Friday. So let me take a step. It's my understanding that the unicorn, the rainbow is a thought bubble. It's representing her identity, gender identity. Gender is, it can be a female, it can be a male, or how would I say the next part? Or another gender, or any other gender, basically. That's gender identity. And then we get the green dots, which correlates to expression. It's how I present myself, feminine or masculine or other. Then we've got, you want to take the next column, the next row, private, so DNA. Do you know intersex? What's your understanding of intersex?
I actually had a very good advice. Definitely where it's not as like can be more complicated than like just have like undeveloped
right, like you don't just have one or the other.
Yeah.
You don't know. Okay. Hold on to your words.
Love, passion, orange, some narrative.
How did that feel? Any reflection?
Romantic attraction is usually what children have. They're not sexual. You can still be romantic.
Yeah.
So
think about how to say it to kids. Did you like practice anything or try anything that worked well?
All the time. And
Or how
that's a
different?
romantic attraction. It's not sexual.
I think it's just
They're
thinking
not
about the
there.
language that I use.
Yeah.
As opposed to just like, oh, it is what it is.
Right.
You can't do that with.
Actually breaking it down more. Yeah.
I think this is a really good example too of like how sometimes we think adults know best, but I've experienced that like this is very simple for students to understand, and so this needs to be like constantly taught to adults a lot of times, and like reminders because we like internalize so many of these binary modalities of being and we need to continually like challenge them.
That's literally why I made you practice it, because this is so much harder for adults to get out of their mouths than it is for kids to understand. Yeah.
I appreciate you explaining it so thoughtfully and thoroughly, because honestly, I've only seen this year. And I didn't realize until you explained that those arrows are a spectrum. I thought it was just pointing to the words. I didn't realize that I didn't realize that it was a zero.
Yeah.
And so I think the first thing would be for adults to have you explain it.
Yeah, I do it in the instructor training for that reason. And I think the other thing about this that I didn't even mention is they actually have a coloring page version that's black and white. So especially with older kids, if you want to build in like self-reflection opportunities in the school day or as a take-home activity, like they can actually fill it out. Like that's the idea of this, is that you can mark on the, and they have examples on the website of like marked up ones. So you could actually write like, my gender identity is more female, and then like gender expression and masculine, or like whatever it is for that person.
So to me, it's very important, and I never knew until. So I used to do parent trainings, and it was just like basic 101, right? But this was like the opening.
Yeah.
And one day I was training a superintendent in Illinois, and we spent the 3 hours on this.
Wow.
Because you know you gotta meet the person where they're at.
Yeah.
Right. He was like, Jordan, you're asking me to rewire my brain.
Yes.
I was like, yes.
Yes, I am.
You know? But it was such an opening to me, and I'm like, okay, it does a lot, right? But it's about where you're willing to meet that person.
Yes.
So it's very important.
Yeah.
We've used this, well, two ways. In Zoom trainings, we have them just mark right on the screen, like, and it's beautiful to see like the spectrum of everybody, where those little marks come up, and then after like coming out day or other trans visibility month, we did this at school. Like this is banned in Florida now. I don't know if you know, but before it was banned. Yes. Before it was banned, we had we had some like a long like scroll of poster paper. And the kids could come up and mark where they were, and they'd make little messages to each other of encouragement, and that was really fun too. You would never force anyone to do that, but for people who want to like, claim their space, you feel powerful.
Yes.
The two things I would add for this, firstly, trans student educational resources. I would just encourage everyone to go to the website, which is transstudent.org. It was founded by 2 trans children who felt like there were not enough trans youth resources in education. So they literally founded it for that reason. So they have resources specifically for trans youth. And I think it's very important to center trans created resources for trans people. And secondly, GLSEN has a similar thing like this, which I don't like GLSENs as much, to be honest. No shade to GLSEN folks. But one of the things that is on there that is not on the gender unicorn is gender attribution. which I always think is important to mention. So I usually try to mention it around gender expression. Even though I'm expressing my gender a certain way, I have no control over the gender that people attribute to me. And that's where the rub comes in, right? So that helps adults understand that even though I may be expressing something, that may not be what other people think I am. And that's what causes the previous slides. The bullying, the suicide ideation, you know, like that's where that comes from. It's because when I'm expressing something, it's not something that you can see. You can't see gender identity. You can only see expression. And my opinion of what is masculine may be different than yours because there's no universal truth around what is masculine, feminine, or androgynous or other.
Yes. Thank you so much for adding that. I also love that glisten diagram, and I think it's kind of like a 102 almost level of this if we like want to dig a little deeper into all of these things. I did want to ask if anybody from Florida has wants to share strategies for talking to young folks about these topics when you can't say a lot of things, or just thoughts, because I don't have that expertise, and if anybody does and wants to share, I would like to open it.
No.
And if not, it's okay.
No pressure.
Well, that was actually already brought up, but we actually used the genderbread person for a while, and Tallahassee actually called out Palm Beach County in particular for using that because it was targeting young people, which we said, yeah, it is. That's what we're using it for. But they actually pulled it out of all of our grades, including beyond grade 3, because they said it was specifically for grooming young people because it was drawn as a cartoonish character, and so it's difficult now to supposedly we can't teach anything in K through 3, although we still get around that by talking about gender roles. And then beyond that, it has to be age appropriate. So we've looked at welcoming schools, of course. We've looked at the American Association of Pediatrics and the American Psychological Association, partners on our CDC grant. They're both NGO partners that have information as far as what's grade appropriate, obviously the national sex education standards. But it's just difficult, and of course right now in legislation they're looking at not being able to teach it in pre-K through 8. And April 19th there's a rule coming down from DOE before that law even passes that's going to make it pre-K through 12, except in sex education. So we're looking at how to get around that. I was both a little bit elated, but also sad. But I was with one of my GSA clubs on Thursday, and they said the only place that I hear about LGBT people is in sex ed. We never get anything in history, which is sad, but at least what I do, it was. Yeah, it's going to be a difficult fight, and I think there have been cases brought. But you kind of have to be able to show that it's causing harm, which we know it will. But a lot of the cases have been thrown out because the student or the parent can't show that there was harm because of this. So I think there's going to have to be harm, like a teacher losing a job, or a teacher who's already made the transition. The new law says you can't use pronouns or honorifics. They have to align with your sex. I think they say biological sex at birth, but anyway, but not on your birth certificate. And so we, as you have mentioned, have transgender teachers in almost all of our schools. I mean, full beards and have gone by Mr. or Miss or Mrs. or Mix for a long time. And now are they not going to be able to do that because it's not what's on your birth certificate? It's at birth. So now are they going to have to go by Miss Smith and use the female restroom? It's not what's coming down. So sorry, I don't mean to be a downer. On a good note.
You're not the downer.
No, you are not. No,
you're doing the work.
She just letting them know that if they need to move to Chicago, I have a lot of protections, and I'm anxious.
Change the
Democratic National Convention will be
Yeah, did you want to ask?
Yeah, I'm just sure. This is a real lawyer question. Like for teachers, you're not giving in your birth certificate when you start a job. So how are they knowing what your sex assigned at birth is unless you tell them what it is, because that's not information that they your health records are protected. There's still privacy or HIPAA rights there. So if you're not providing that to them, how would they know? So I'm just trying to think of like, I don't know. It's just a bad situation, but also you don't need to disclose that to them, and they shouldn't have that record for you anyway. And you can totally say like under HIPAA, like you're not going to answer that question and protect your privacy, your rights to medical privacy.
Yeah, these are questions I wish I had answers to, but I don't. Just for sake of time, I'm going to move us forward, but I hope we can keep talking about all of this. So our next strategy from the gender spectrum guide is distinguish patterns from rules. This is one of my favorites. Emphasizing similarities across bodies. My favorite fact to share with folks is that our human bodies are a whole lot more similar than they are different, regardless of what parts we have. So we can talk about similarities over differences. And I think this is a strategy that anybody can do in your education about health and, people growing up. Knowing that many puberty changes happen for most people, like body hair, body odor, acne, mood changes, like we all are growing and developing and have these common things that happen to us, regardless of what bodies we have, and acknowledging that everybody has estrogen and testosterone at varying levels. It's something that a lot of adults don't even know, but it's just about the ratio of like how much of what hormone you have that affects how your body is. And then emphasizing patterns over rules. So this is really important for being inclusive of intersex students, as well as anyone who might have just differences in the way that they go through puberty and the way that their body develops. So the easiest strategy here, and this is another one that people can do even if they can't be as explicitly inclusive, is just saying some or most more often when we're talking about people. We're talking about people's health and different health outcomes. Just like some people with penises might experience wet dreams during puberty, or some or most people, or some people who menstruate have cramps when they get their period, but that's not something that happens to everyone, not making these broad generalizations. And a lot of these things are just about being more accurate also. In sex ed, a lot of these strategies are about being more accurate. Is that the next activity? No, not yet. But the other thing that you already saw alluded to on that side is about emphasizing physiology rather than gender. So not assigning gender to things unnecessarily in sex ed. So while I have here using gender inclusive language in general is important to doing this. So things like giving people scholars, students, rather than boys and girls. And then removing gender from anatomical and physiological terms. So like I just said, when someone begins menstruating, we're talking about menstruation. So we're saying someone who's menstruating, not saying women, because not all women menstruate, not all people who menstruate are women. So we're being more accurate in addition to being inclusive. So my strategy here is typically to say what you mean. If you can't figure out which word to use for something, think about the thing you're talking about. So if I'm talking about wet dreams, I'm talking about penises. So people with penises. Or if I'm talking about menstruation, people who menstruate, menstruators. Yeah, so those are some strategies there. And then explaining which hormone is responsible for puberty changes without assuming gender. So people who go through testosterone dominant puberty or estrogen dominant puberty is a phrase that I've heard, or like testosterone causes bodies to do this when they're growing up, or people who have more estrogen might experience this or something like that, so that we can acknowledge the physiological changes rather than assigning gender to them. So this table is something that we adapted from genderinclusivebiology.com. I actually learned about gender inclusive biology at this conference last year, so shout out to them. Really, really good resource if you're looking for also like scientific justification for this. It is more accurate, and that website has a lot of great resources for like why this is just the right way to teach biology. So this chart says, instead of saying men, boys, male, we're going to focus on the organ, the functional activity, or the role. So an example of that would be, instead of saying men produce sperm, we're going to say testes produce sperm. We're getting more specific and more accurate when we do that. So it's more accurate to focus on body parts and their functions than it is to focus on a person's identity. And also we're acknowledging that all people experience different bodies, reproduction, and families. Not everybody has the same experience, even if they have, you know, an identity in common. So there's a couple more examples there, but I'm going to have.
Marissa, I would change the can in your examples to me.
Oh yeah, thank you. All right, so now we're gonna do we'll just do this practice as a whole group. So I'm gonna put a phrase up here, and if somebody can volunteer and tell me how you would replace the gendered and inaccurate language and reword the phrase. So the first one is when a girl gets her period. We do a gender neutral, more accurate reframe. Yeah.
When someone starts menstruating.
Yeah, when someone starts menstruating, exactly. Or when a person gets their period. A baby grows in a woman's uterus.
A baby can grow in a uterus?
A baby grows in a uterus. This is one of my favorite examples to show, because a lot of times we just have extra words, like you just don't need that word in that sentence for it to be understandable. A baby grows in a uterus. All boys have wet dreams during puberty.
Some people might have wet dreams. People with dreams.
Yes, either of those. Perfect. Female condom demonstration.
Oh, internal condom.
Thank you. Yes, internal condoms. Condoms don't have genders. That would be weird. When a mommy and a daddy love each other very much. Yes.
Just don't say it.
Just don't say it. Just don't say it. When a person gets pregnant, I think that's where we're going with that. Which is our next, I might have just spoiled the answer for one of these. Okay, so one of my favorite questions to make teachers practice in trainings is, where do babies come from? Because they freak out so much. That might be an answer. So I would love for somebody to give us a model answer. If we're going to try using gender neutral language to answer, where do babies come from? How would you respond to this question from a first grader? And we're going to do a middle schooler next. So if you're a middle school person, you can go next. But primary, yeah.
Okay. I love this. But I would tell baby or first grader, I would say babies come from other people, and it could come from uteruses inside some people's bodies. And then I guess I would have to figure out the follow-up.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So keeping it simple is the right approach with especially younger kids, but always, like, just, we talk about functional knowledge and answering sensitive questions in our training. So just answering the question the student is asking. So the most simple answer to this question is, some people can get pregnant and then a baby grows in their body. A lot of people say uterus, and I'm like, do first graders know the word uterus? No. So you could teach them the word uterus. That's one option. You could say there's an organ in the body where babies grow, and some people have this, and it's called the uterus, and that's where a baby grows. That's generally the kid's gonna be like, okay, and run away most of the time. If they have more questions, they can ask. Anybody want to give me a gender neutral answer to this from a 7th grader? Maybe they're asking, like, how does pregnancy happen? Or how does somebody get pregnant? Or how's a baby made without gender? A brave soul. Give me someone new. Yes.
Just something when a sperm grows and egg, a baby grows.
Yeah.
Never develops.
Exactly.
Yes.
So 7th graders, they have a lot more language for this already. They know sperm, egg, uterus. They've learned their reproductive anatomy if they're getting comprehensive sex ed. Hopefully you don't have to, if you're starting from there, it's going to be a longer conversation. But yes, we can talk about a sperm needs to come in contact with an egg. Esther has taught me my favorite thing, which is you need 3 things to make a baby. You need a cell from one body, a cell from another body, and a place for it to grow. So sperm, egg have to meet and implant in a uterus, and then a pregnancy can happen. That is the simple answer for 7th grader without gender. Great job, y'all. How are we on time? Running out. Okay. So describing many pathways to adult bodies. This is acknowledging that puberty looks different for everyone. We talked about a lot of this already, but variation across all bodies. It's okay that everybody goes through puberty at different times. Also acknowledging, like, if there's something where something feels wrong or like it's not right in your body, like that's the time to go to a doctor and talk about it. But like we can see trends, like most people go through puberty between 8 and 14, and if that's like different for you, that's okay. But if it's like really off, then you might want to talk to your doctor, right? So this is a great opportunity to include intersex and trans people in discussions about puberty. We can talk about puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapy, medical support during puberty might also be required for other reasons. Some people use puberty blockers if they have precocious puberty, like if they're going through puberty really early. So that's not just something that trans folks use, or people who are questioning their gender identity. So that is describe many pathways to adult bodies. Some examples. And then describe any pathways to families. This is the other place I have some second grade standard examples. We're going to acknowledge that all relationships are valid. We can do this in different ways at different ages. So recognizing that all families look different. Even if we can't specifically talk about like gay parents in the classroom, we can talk about how like families are different and all families are valid and we love all families. And that's great. And people should be able to talk about their families. We're not going to assume heterosexual baseline or norm, not assuming that people have a mom and dad at home. And then as they get older, not assuming in all of our examples of when we do like healthy relationships, using diverse pronouns and different relationship structures to talk about when we are talking about healthy relationships with older students. So teaching about different types of families is also part of the standards. So those are just some examples of the standards. Students need to be able to identify different kinds of families and explain why it's important to show respect for different kinds of families. So teaching students to be respectful of each other. All right, so that is all the like teaching strategies. These are just some tips that I accumulated on this slide about making a curriculum more inclusive. So if you're revising a curriculum, if you already have a curriculum you're working with and you want to teach it in a more inclusive way, you can change your language verbally, even if you can't change the lesson plans or the worksheets. So even if a worksheet has to say like women reproductive system and man reproductive system, like you don't have to say that. You can say people with vulvas, people with uteruses, or whatever it is. Even just adding most in front of boys and girls, if you have to do the gendered puberty education, like most girls go through this change during puberty, or most boys go through this thing during puberty, we're at least making space for like differences. And removing gender where it's not necessary, like we saw in that example, like just cut out the word if you don't need the word in the sentence. And then changing headers on slides or worksheets. So even if you can't like, you know, fully change your whole curriculum, you can just change the, or remove the header from the worksheet. Like if it says women or female or whatever, you could just take it off, like just give them the image. In the 3 R's, which I'll mention in a second, they have like reproductive system 1, reproductive system 2, or we'll say like reproductive system with a uterus or reproductive system with testicles or whatever it is. Changing names and pronouns in example scenarios. So if you're doing like healthy relationships educational, there's a lot of scenarios in those types of lesson plans. So we could just change the names to be gender neutral, change the pronouns to be gender neutral and that kind of thing. Oh, this got messed up from going from Google Slides to PowerPoint, but emphasizing that puberty changes happen for all people. So talking about how bodies are more alike than different, like I mentioned, my favorite fact. Yeah. And then these are just, this is just a collection of resources. I'm happy to have these slides shared out and all these things are hyperlinked in the end of the presentation. But just shouting out a lot of the resources that I've used over the years to learn all this information and to make this presentation. So the sex ed standards, I referenced a lot. I talked about Gender Spectrum's guide, Gender Inclusive Biology, and then there's a really great guide called Intersex 101 and another pamphlet that's called What We Wish Our Teachers Knew from Interact, which is an incredible organization run by intersex youth. And that's how I've learned a lot of what I know about intersex folks. And then there is a call to action document about LGBTQ inclusive sex ed that's signed off on by a lot of organizations working on sexual health. And then Advocates for Youth 3 R's, there's a free sex ed curriculum. That's what a lot of our CPS curriculum is adapted from, that I know a lot of people make use of that resource. And they have been revising their lesson plans to make them more gender inclusive. Some of their older lesson plans are still pretty gendered, but a lot of the newer ones that are coming out are not. They're removing that. So if you're already using 3 R's, make sure you're looking at like the new stuff they're putting out because they keep updating things as time goes on to align with the new standards also. And then there's also like an academic article about the case for comprehensive sex ed that I like to reference a lot too, that just demonstrates the need for comprehensive sex ed. It's a, what is it called when you put a bunch of studies together? Meta-analysis, something like that. And they make a case for comprehensive sex ed and also specifically name that comprehensive sex ed needs to be LGBTQ inclusive. I didn't even say that. That's just like a thing we always say in our trainings. Comprehensive sex ed means like everyone is included. It wouldn't be comprehensive if everybody is not included. So if we're teaching comprehensive sex ed, it has to be LGBTQ inclusive to actually fit that name. So that's another tidbit if you need to defend yourself. All right, then that's it. That's my email. I'm also here today, so let me know if you want to talk. And any questions or comments? If we have one, which maybe?
I guess I have a question.
Yeah.
You were talking to people about how to explain. But what if the kid comes back and say, my mother said, you know,
yeah, that's a great question. I would approach that by telling the student, like, everybody talks about these things differently at home, right? Like we might have different ways that people talk about these things in our homes, but at school, we're going to talk about it in this way and just like create that shared language for the school environment so that everybody's included, acknowledging that like different families have different beliefs and might talk about it differently at home. So that's what I would do. Yeah.
What kind of, I think there's so many teachers in CPS, and I know like some of how the process works because I went through it myself to be the health instructor, but have like what kind of accountability is there, because so many teachers is the first time they're getting comprehensive health education, and then they're going to be teaching it. Like, what does that look like, or how well do you think that's happening?
Yes, I wish I had a better answer to this question. I'll just say that up front. We don't have a lot of accountability systems in CPS to actually enforce our policies in the Office of Student Health and Wellness, at least. One thing that is a big part of the reason why I'm updating our curriculum is because our current curriculum and some curriculum I've seen have been like, you know, be mindful of different identities, and it'll just like give that as a note to the teacher up front. We're rewriting our curriculum so that it is, you can read it off a script word for word and it will be inclusive. Like you don't have to think about it. So like that's my goal, is like, I don't need a teacher to be super like knowledgeable about all of these things. They can just read the lesson plan as it's written and like say things in an inclusive way. It's still challenging with like teachers being able to handle student questions well. And I think it's just a learning process for everyone. But I will say in my 3 years working at CPS, I have seen significant improvements in the teachers' abilities to talk about gender identity and sexual orientation. I think it's changing, and like more teachers are holding each other accountable and like seeking out support from us when they need it. So it's not perfect. We don't have real like actual accountability measures to be like, you can't teach sex ed anymore because you talk this way, but we're doing our best.
The training is the main.
And the training, we do require that teachers go through training before they can access our curriculum, and they get a mini version of this presentation. Yeah, sure.
Onto that answer. So a lot of my job is explaining this content to people who do not get it. Like the people who go through this training and like know like LGBTQ inclusion like 101, they're not the ones that like are problematic or like need help. Like I have more interactions with like the people who don't know the difference between sex and gender. And Tina made this really good comment earlier when we had a small group discussion about he said the catering to the ones who are ready and not the ones who are ready instead of the resistance. So like we're focusing more on like who just like needs a little bit of help to get there, rather than like who is like combative and like resistant to what we're doing.
Yeah.
And in terms of like getting those people to where we need them to be, I try to use analogies that they already understand to say like, look, you're already doing this work. We're asking you to apply it to this situation as well. So sometimes when I'm talking to people, I'm like, how can you make your sex ed, your health education, or your classroom in general, LGBTQ inclusive? And they were like, oh no. And I said, well, you do know, like a lot of times they say, I treat everyone the same. And I'm like, well, that answer the kid, I'm like, having some color. Like, you're not treating all your kids the same, you're treating them differently. But I'll say something like, you make accommodations for diverse learners. You make accommodations for students who are parents, pregnant or parenting. Like, you're not just doing one thing at the beginning of the year and saying, oh, I've included that, I don't have to do anything else. It's an ongoing commitment to making sure that our diverse learners are included and getting resources they need. So you're not teaching it, you're not like treating everyone the same, and that's okay, because you're meeting them where they're at. Or like if they struggle with like understanding the concept of consent and like how to teach that with students, I'll tell them, well, I'm sure that you already say, keep your hands to yourself. I'm like, oh yeah. I'm like, okay, then you aren't talking about like consent to some degree. So I try to, sometimes it feels like really overwhelming to them. They're like, this is so new, I don't know how to do it. I'm like, you are already doing it in some way. And like building those connections that like, we're not asking you to do something that's completely foreign to you, so that it feels more relatable. And they're like, oh, okay, well, I guess I can talk to students about keeping their hands to themselves, and I can do this other thing. This is less of a stretch.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
So before, yeah, go ahead.
Just really quick, do you have community partners you work with? Because in Grand Rapids,
they don't do it, and so the the local gay lesbian center has been doing classes for both parents and students on inclusive sex ed. So if you just know it's not an option in your school, who can like people turn to?
Yes, yeah, we do in Chicago have some community organizations that will do presentations. Yeah, like this. Yeah, we can talk. Yeah.
Okay.